Aha! Never mind that. Let's watch this.
I started out dreaming of being a writer, and then I wanted to be a painter. And I was good at neither one. So what I did is take two ineptitudes and make one aptitude. I really, suddenly it came upon a field which was there waiting for the talents, however limited, that I had.
Well, we've been exclusively doing Will's work. He's a giant in the field. This, I think, is his 55th year doing comics. He was there at the birth of comics. And he's somebody who not only spans the history of comics, but he's been an innovator all the way. He's been someone that other cartoonists mimicked and looked to for inspiration.
Charles Schulz may be richer and Garfield may be better known, but Will Eisner was the best of the first and the first of the best. So happy 50th birthday to the Spirit from Commander Rick. Hit it, Nancy.
Rising anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe has voted English-only sign. 40,000 tons of armed with PCBs blew up the ozone layer today.
Standing by for solid rocket booster separation.
Greetings down there on Earth. This is Commander Rick, hijacking your signal from my perch high up in space. You know, living up here in a communication satellite, watching TV all day, I've realized we live in an age of excess. Well, you live in an age of excess. I'm stuck up here drinking my own sweat to get by. But you can't really blame people for pigging out and being excessive these days. I mean, we have Stone Age bodies in a silicon chip world. Human taste buds were designed to taste nuts and berries, and suddenly we've developed chocolate sundaes and a nice thick corned beef sandwich with a pickle on the side. Our caveman ancestors in their whole lives never tasted anything as delicious as what you probably scarfed down for breakfast today. In their whole lives, they never saw anything as amazing as a music video or as comfortable as a waterbed or as exciting as rock and roll. It's no wonder people pig out on pleasures these days. The pleasures are so incredible. Some comics and a lot of movies are pigging out on excess today, too. You know, tasty little tidbits that really have nothing to do with reality, like arms ripped off, heads exploding, things like that. Hey, it's easy to do, so why not? A better question might be why. In 1940, when Will Eisner created the Spirit, life was a lot simpler. And in the 50 years since, everything has changed. Everything. Technology, society, morality, religion, the family, housing has changed. But there is one thing that has not changed. We have the same bodies. These are the same bodies and the same brains, basically, that we've had for tens of thousands of years. And that's why after 55 years in comics, Will Eisner remains on the cutting edge, because he writes about that one constant, that one thing that never changes, human beings. And that's why we have to talk about him today.
Comic books began in 1935 when some very enterprising publisher put together daily strips, pasted them together into a magazine format, 8.5 by 11 size format, and the title was Famous Funnies. It became very popular, sold very well, and a lot of publishers followed suit, and that gave way to the production of original art material, original stories, which gave me my start in my career. That's where I came on the scene.
Will Eisner and I went to DeWitt Clinton in the Bronx together, and we were on the Clinton News. And Will Eisner always got more of his drawings in the Clinton News than I, and I was always jealous of that. And he was a better artist than I, and then ironically and prophetically, he left, graduated, and I won an art scholarship to an art school in New York at the Flatiron Building for 2 years. And so I was doodling, and then on the side I was trying to crack the cartoon market, and he went into partnership with a fellow called Jerry Iger, and became Eisner and Iger.
I formed a partnership with Iger. I was 19 years old at the time, after having... and we saw the audience then as juveniles, we call them 10-year-old kids from Kansas City. The main thrust of comics at those days were aimed at children, at youngsters. The stories were simplistic stories. Generally, they were imitations of the classic adventure stories. Some of them were imitations of the daily strips that were prevalent of the day, because in those days, adventure, continuity, daily strips dominated the story field. But there was one other ingredient that I saw as a tremendous opportunity, which gave me a source of material, and that was the pulps. The pulps at that moment were dying. Now, I don't know if you remember what the pulps were, but the pulps were the forerunner of what you see today as paperbacks. They contained short stories, some of the great short story writers with illustrations. I brought that idea into the comics we were doing at the time. But it wasn't until the Spirit days that I began doing more adult material. The Register and Tribune Syndicate in Ireland wanted what they called in those days a costume character, and what we call today superhero characters. Superman had begun to make its name and was getting very, very popular. Batman had just arrived. They felt that that was the thing they wanted to have. They wanted to get somebody to give them a superhero character or a costume character. Well, I didn't want to do that. All I wanted was a character that would give me a detective story, rather, that would give me the opportunity to write the kind of stories I would like to write. It required then a character that had dimensions to it. But to accommodate them, I said, okay, I'll give him a costume. And I put a mask on his face and a pair of gloves and this blue suit. The mask ultimately was really one of the biggest problems I have had in all the years, because to show a man walking down the subway talking to people wearing a mask and nobody paying any attention to the fact that it was total idiocy, but it worked for a while.
When the Spirit came out, it was different, really different. And it was an insert in a magazine. There were 7 pages inside, you know, in sepia. And it was an expensive magazine because they were buying these reprints. And I was going to elementary school, and it came out Wednesdays. And was the only day that I skipped the bus, because the guy will deliver the comics to the door of my neighbor, which could afford them, put them in the doorsteps with a newspaper and everything. And I will hide on the steps until the delivery man will leave. Then I will read the Spirit, put it back, and run all the way to school. And I arrived probably an hour late. But like every Wednesday, I arrive an hour late. The teachers thought it was something that I had to do at the house, so I never got caught by anybody. But that was how important it was to me. It was a routine. It was a ritual for me to read the Spirit. First, because there were 7 pages. They were finished. They were concise. They had a beginning, a middle, and an end. The characters were totally developed. They had a lot of humor and a lot of adventure and a mystery. And it was an era that it was still very close. As the Space and the Moon is to the new kids, that field of mystery was alive in the 40s. It was just after the war, and there were spies, and it was perfect. It was so beautiful, and all his collaborators and everything had done such a team that it was just perfection to read. Even in translation, it worked very well. And all the special effects on the first page with the drips, and it was magic.
You must remember that every artist, a writer working in a medium, a visual graphic medium like this, is conscious of the language of his times. In order to communicate with your audience, you must talk in their language. Film has become very much a part of our language or our understanding. Film was a very, very important literary communication form in the 30s particularly, albeit black and white, but it was very important. The photography and camera work was beginning to become extremely sophisticated. It was in those years that they developed what they called Rembrandt lighting, Moody Shadows and so forth that came out of the Fritz Lang movies and so forth. Now, all those things I was aware of, and I realized that that was part of the language I'd have to use to communicate.
His filmic abilities, redefining the viewpoint by just taking your eye and putting it wherever you wanted to for the dramatic intent of the story. Well, it was like somewhere the foundation had been laid for me to understand that you could do this, but I would never have done it myself without seeing his work. As soon as I saw his work, I went, oh, I get it. Now I know what you can do. And every once in a while during the years, which it would have been like 22 years now, the first time I've seen the work, I'd go back to it and remember that you can do anything in comics, because it's comics. And he has done it all in his own way. And he's opened the door and just rolled the carpet out for anybody who wants to. Just jump, go, run, have a great time with it. Yes, that's the kind of influence. Whenever I start feeling a little tame, I'll remember, wait a minute, if Will Eisner were doing this, we wouldn't see this dull panel here. We could just, we'll stay outside the window looking through the bars and watch the drips of the water and tilt it to the side and then have a shadow of somebody on the wall reflected in the mirror, right? And it's all in the eye of a fly or something. Terrific.
I believe that comics are a third communication form. There's text with words only, there's film, and in between the two are comics. And comics is a more than an art form. It's a literary form. It's a literary / art form. I think of myself these days as a writer who writes with pictures. I've learned how to draw well, and I'm skillful at it now after many years of practice. But the purpose of my artwork is to write, to tell a story, to communicate an idea.
When I was a kid, the spirit appeared. Now, I don't really know if this has anything to do with Will's politics or not, but the spirit appeared, at least in New York, in a very radical newspaper. And I come from a radical background. My father would not buy the Journal American, which had a fabulous Sunday section. It had Flash Gordon and everything, but he wouldn't touch it because it was a right-wing rag. But he did buy the paper that carried the Spirit because it was very radical. So I didn't get to read Flash Gordon, but I read the Spirit every Sunday. And God, was it easy to love. My father would bring home the paper. I'd grab the Spirit section. His women, again, as a little girl who relates to females, all little girls relate to females, all little boys relate to males. His women were so strong that I could read. I just loved the comics. And then his work is simply easy to read. You talk about communicate. I forget about Reagan. Will Eisner is the great communicator.
Eisner wrote and drew the Spirit, but eventually 7 pages in 7 days started to require some help. Nancy, do you know who worked with Eisner on the Spirit? Nancy is my computer, NanoCyber 3000, Nancy. Some illustrious names there. As time passed, the comic strip evolved. Some weeks, the Spirit wasn't even involved, as Eisner and his team focused less on adventures and more on human emotional stories. Will, why the change?
I'll tell you the reason for it. It was very simple. I grew up. One of the things you must recognize is that the artists working in this field, those who write and draw, do grow up.
Eisner began to put limitations on himself as a writer and an artist. What if the Spirit spent a whole story tied up in a chair? Or what if the Spirit solved a case while he was unconscious? By constantly putting up these kind of walls, Eisner kept discovering new doors. By changing the borders, he managed to change and find new shapes. By creating problems, he discovered solutions. Will, was there a big difference when you left the Spirit and started working on longer stories?
Yes, indeed. It was, a matter of fact, it was a great relief. I was suddenly without any boundary whatsoever. I could write at any length I could. I've spent many years working within 7 pages, where I had a story that had to be tailored each week to fit the 7 pages. Sometimes the story was very thin and I had to stretch it, and sometimes I had to condense it. But my problem always had more ideas that I could cram into any one story. In the graphic novel, there was suddenly a huge freedom. I could go as long as I want, and there was no one there to tell me how long I could go. The thing about the graphic novel is that it gives you an opportunity to develop depth in the characters, to develop dimensions in characters. And it's one of the things really I'm working on now. I feel that that's one of the areas that have yet to be fully explored and exploited. And this is really what I'm working on. It's not so much the visual that I'm concerned about anymore. I'm concerned about the character dimensions and character analysis. And that's the advantage of the graphic novel.
People like Will Eisner who, you know, as much as maybe some of the things being done today might be considered on the cutting edge of something new and exciting and a different twist, or taking the medium to another height or level, or you know, reaching that, it being called an art, which I believe it should be, you know, instead of like funny books as people look down on it. People like Eisner and Kirby, they were the cutting edge. They created this world that we exist in, and showed so many possibilities, and you know, instantly. I mean, it was so raw, and nothing came before. It was like this blast out and do all this stuff, and the huge range and all the different things that were going on, and the way different ways of telling storytelling and stuff. It's you know, I couldn't say enough about him.
After The Spirit, Will Eisner began working for the United States government, developing programs that used comic books to teach.
When I got into the Army, I had an opportunity to introduce the idea because I got involved in training, and I suggested the use of this as a training medium. It was a fairly easy sell because the Army in those days were grasping for anything they could get. And it was instantly very successful.
What advantages do comics have that other forms of teaching materials don't?
It transmits ideas at the speed of sight, if you will. I can invent a word. I had some experience overseas in the Far East during the Korean War and later on the Vietnamese War when I was over there. And I found that the manuals or the instructions that were produced in this medium had the distinct advantage of transcending language barriers. And they conveyed ideas without having to worry about translation. That was very archaic. For example, the Koreans when I, had no word for automobile when I was there.